Everybody's waited patiently long enough. So I just want to keep this very brief. It's proud and everyone's been kind enough to come out. I'm Richard DeWingert, and I'm the proud owner of Head House Books. Actually, everyone thought I was like a molecule away from madness when I opened 15 years ago. But we're still thriving and got a great community, and I love doing events like this with Philadelphia authors, and there are a lot of connections. One of your colleagues is my neighbor and speaks very highly of Sara. That's Francis. And so thank you for coming out. And thank you to Jo, another best-selling author, journalist, done so much with us. You've been with us a few times. So many events here. Yeah, either in conversation or as the headline. This is Jo's recent best-selling book, We Are Not Like Them. And of course, this is Sara's book that everyone knows, and we're really eager, which I loved, and very eager to hear you talk about it. Get some good answers, Jo.
I'm going to try. I'm not worried about it.
So I'm going to keep it at that, very brief. Thank you to everyone for coming out. And if we could give both of them a hand in advance, that would be terrific.
Guys, we're in person. This is crazy. Like, I just can't like even process it. I didn't know what to wear. I was like, do I have to wear pants tonight? It was very confusing. We did two in-person events when we launched in October. One in New York and one in Nashville. And then I've had 100 Zoom events. So we were just talking about Zoom and how I still don't know where to put the computer. I put it on trash cans, I pile it on books, and I don't know where it's supposed to go. So the first question I want to ask you is about the title of this book. Because it really got me. Because I feel like we're all maybe a molecule away from madness. Like, it feels like it could happen to anyone. So did you come up with the title, or did your publisher?
So it's a great question, and actually I'm glad we have Jeff O'Beery in the audience, who had a little bit of an editing hand in the title. So my initial was it was a molecule of madness, and then Jeff pointed out that it's actually a molecule from madness. And then the title, the publisher added away from. So it was a slow burn, an evolution.
Mm-hmm. It always is. And then sometimes they change your title completely. Yeah. But it really catches you. And so, why did you decide that you wanted to write this book in the first place?
I think I've always been fascinated by these stories of patients who have these wild personality-altering conditions where they essentially become someone else. Mm-hmm. So we sort of think of, you think of a couple going to marriage therapy where someone says, this isn't the person I married. And this is actually the case where that's actually true from a molecular level, where these people they become different people. And these conditions are they're incredibly complex, both at a scientific level, but also at a social level. And I liked the sort of interface of those.
Well, the book has such great storytelling, too. It doesn't feel, and this is the highest compliment, it does not feel like it was written by a neuroscientist. It feels like it feels like it was written by someone who is a really great storyteller. Not that neuroscientists can't be, but I have read books that can be very dry sometimes. But it's so engaging, and their characters, even though they're real people, come off of the page. I know that you got your great New York Times review today. Did everyone read that? Oh, it's fantastic. Hold on, I'm going to pull it up. It's so much better than the Times review that I got for that book.
My mom has sent it to 1,800 people, so you're probably...
Don't worry, you guys. It's in your inbox. But no, it was a great review. But it opens with the story of Lauren Kane. And, essentially that she had been sucked into a zombie apocalypse. Can you tell us? I can't think of a better opening for a Times review. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah, so this, Lauren was a woman she was highly accomplished, went to this elite university, graduated with a plan to become a writer, actually, and went home, started binge watching The Walking Dead, and then woke up one morning, went downstairs, asked her mom what was for breakfast. They chatted a little bit, and then she went back to sleep. And she woke up again and asked again, what's for breakfast? And her mom was a little bit perplexed, and she went back to bed, woke up, asked the same thing again, and then at that point her mom was sort of like, that's weird, that's not like her. She ends up getting a fever, gets really wobbly. Her mom takes her to the emergency room, and they're sitting in the emergency room, and she essentially becomes acutely psychotic, where she starts attacking people in the emergency room. She pushes her mom down on the floor. They get 9 security guards come and have to jump on her to keep her from escaping, essentially. And she gets admitted to this hospital. No one can figure out what's going on. And her mom actually comes across an article about a disease that causes young women to become psychotic. And she sort of shows it to the team, and at least according to the mom's account, the team sort of poo-pooed it. Yeah, but eventually she turned out to be right, and the disease was identified, and she actually got treated and is doing great. And she actually published her first piece very recently that it won an award.
It's so fascinating that that is possible in our brains, and I think that's what makes each of these stories so interesting. Why did you feel like you were the person that had to write this? Like, why did you feel called to write this book?
I guess I always liked. I liked writing, and so it felt like first for a while I used to write more memoir type pieces, and then at some point my husband told me to stop writing about our marriage, so I had to find something else to write about.
No, so did mine, and then I wrote a book called How to Be Married.
And you wrote your New York Times article
because I was like, don't tell me what to do. So be careful.
And you had your great New York Times article about
how to train a husband,
exactly,
like a dog. Yeah, we're still married.
But yeah, so I moved more from memoir, and then I wrote some pieces about sort of dying and palliative care type ideas, and then I realized I should just write about what I'm actually studying and what I'm actually
doing. Yeah.
And I think it's sort of an area that's not covered as much in the lay press.
Yeah, no, I mean, I have been in the lay press for 20 years, and I've never heard any of these stories, so it's very exciting for me to start reading. In the book, I think that the patients are just as interesting as the doctors, and you really bring in their backstories, too, and how they came to discover this disease. Did you have a favorite doctor?
I always have a soft spot for Joseph Goldberger, who is this guy. There's a disease called pellagra, which is it's sort of this grotesque disease that causes this disfiguring rash, an upset stomach, and this really pervasive dementia. And it turns out there was a epidemic of pellagra in the early 1900s in the southeastern U.S. And hundreds of thousands of people were coming down with it, and nobody could figure out what was causing it. And there was essentially fear struck into the hearts of people across the country. And so the Surgeon General calls on this guy, Joseph Goldberger. And he was this public health officer. He was born at the foot of the Carpathian Mountains, came here at age 9, speaking no English at all, works his way up to become a doctor, tries to hang a shingle and can't make enough money. So he says, okay, I'll become a public health officer. And he does all this work going all over the country, catching many of the diseases that he was studying. So he got typhus, he got yellow fever, he got typhoid. And then the Surgeon General says, why don't you figure out this pellagra story? And at the time it was really controversial because there was one idea that a lot of people liked, which was that the disease was caused by an infection that was transmitted by flies. And people like that idea.
Yeah, it sounds familiar. Yeah.
Right. And so people like that idea because pellagra tended to affect poor people, so it allowed them to say, well, it's their fault. It's a problem of their own sanitation. And Goldberger came in, and he said, I don't think it's infectious. I think it's caused by a nutritional deficiency, which was a really hard explanation to stomach for people because it basically meant that we were starving our own people. So everyone says, you're totally wrong. And he goes as far as to say, you know what, I'm gonna prove to you that this isn't infectious. And so he does something that you could never do now, and nobody would ever want to do now. But he basically takes blood from these patients and he scrapes off scales from their skin, and he takes samples of their stool and their urine, and he sort of mixes it all together, injects some, eats some. A lot of his colleagues also participate because they have so much confidence in him. And his wife actually volunteers, although he says, I'll do the blood part, but I'm not doing the rest. He sort of wants to shield her. And in the end, he writes this thing that says, considering the amount of filth that we took in, we did pretty well. And none of them came down with pellagra.
None of them, yeah.
And he
all of these doctors are so intrepid. That's the thing. And also so many of them in the book are told that they're wrong. That so much of this is about perseverance and the system saying no, you can't do this, and then they kind of have to fight it. It's against all odds, right?
Yeah. So it's totally true, and I think I had no idea about that before I started reading about them. Even so, the original Alzheimer he did his research, discovers essentially plaques and tangles, which is now the hallmark of this disease that's so widespread. He goes to this meeting in Germany, presents his findings, and there's just complete silence in the audience, and no one seems to care. Someone later writes that they thought his presentation was inappropriate. And then later in the day, someone makes this presentation about excessive masturbation, and it's like the favorite of the conference. Everyone wants to talk about it. And here, he just made this incredible discovery and no one recognizes. And he ends up going back to the laboratory, toiling away for several years until he finally gets recognized, and then he dies sort of shortly thereafter.
Yeah, I mean, that's how it happens. Do you think that the book is going to slightly terrify people who are then going to be convinced that they are like literally
okay.
that they have at least 6 of the problems that are in this book? Because I think I have 3.
I meant for the book to be optimistic, and then earlier drafts, I think, didn't come off as optimistic as I wanted. So there were some intentional changes made. But there's sort of 2 ways you could think about it, because either you could say, look, the brain is the most complex machine known to humankind, but we have so many Achilles heels, and there are so many ways to take us down that we're so fragile. And the other way you could say is, look around at all the people around you. Most of us are doing okay. Yeah. If you take an average 65-year-old, more likely than not, they're going to go through their whole life and never get dementia. So you could also say, actually, we're living this picture of resilience in the face of all these things that can happen to us.
We're all still standing. It's all of us for right now. How many of the doctors in this book were women? We talked about this a little bit on our call, and I think it's an interesting thing to think about, in terms of how medicine and the medical fields have evolved.
Yeah, so I've never been asked that question, and actually only one of the doctors in the book is female, and she's the most sort of recent researcher. And I think because all these stories that are from the early 1900s,
right,
there weren't really women doing the work. They were relegated to other tasks. But the woman that I write about in this book is Nancy Wexler, who is this brilliant woman who essentially revolutionized the field of genetics and established this technique for finding which genes cause which diseases. So she had been a Fulbright scholar. She's on vacation in Europe, and she gets a call from her dad who says, can you come home for my birthday? And she says, she's sort of thinking to herself, like, that's weird. He wouldn't usually call me to come home for his birthday. But she goes home, and he sits her down with her sister and explains that their mom has Huntington's disease, and that they now have a 50% chance that they've inherited the gene that causes it. And she essentially overhauls her whole life. So she ends up doing her doctoral thesis about Huntington's disease, and then she starts going on a quest. She wants to find a cure, but she realizes to find the cure, she has to find the gene. So she goes on a quest to find the gene. And she basically sets up these workshops where she gets lots of different scientists from different specialties to try to collaborate. And then eventually they actually found the gene that causes Huntington's disease, and that was the first gene that was found with this technique, and then many, many more genes were found the same way. And she actually, that technology is what allows us to now do genetic testing for Huntington's disease, and she never took the test. And eventually people started noticing that her movements were a little bit different than the average person. And just relatively recently, there was a big article in the New York Times where she talked about sort of openly having the disease.
There's just so many stories behind each of these, and I've never heard of any of these people. I mean, obviously, and I've heard Alzheimer's, right? But never once did I think about the person behind naming the disease. And that's what's so interesting about this. How did you do a lot of the writing and research? So how much first person did you get to do, and how much archival? How did it all come together?
So the patients were all patients who I interviewed them. So it was a lot of renting cars and driving up to their houses. I remember at one point I went to rent the car and they were like, well, we've upgraded you to a giant truck or something. So there was the neat experience of trying to navigate. So that was sort of the living patients or their families. And then the archival stuff mostly was done. A lot of the stuff, there's actually a lot of things that have been published about it, and it's not that hard to find. I think that I don't think that the books I checked out had been checked out for a very long time, but they're all there, and there's actually an incredible amount of literature on it.
Yeah, and they are all there, but this is the first time that I've ever seen the stories put together in a book like this. So what comes next? Like, what do you want to do another book?
I'd like to do another book. Sometimes I have thoughts of doing something like the handbook for the aging brain, because we have lots of people who come in and talk about, is this normal? Am I normal? And I don't think that there's that much out there for people in knowing, what does it mean to actually age, and realizing that actually cognitive decline is a part of normal aging. So if you're worried about your cognition, you shouldn't be asking, am I worse this year than I was 5 years ago, but rather, am I worse than my peers? Something like that. And then I have a small thought of trying to write a children's book. But
tell us about that. What would it be about? Because I
do have the plot, but I'll spare you.
All right. Well, because what I was going to tell you, and because I've written both nonfiction and fiction, I'm like, oh my God, any of these stories could be like just woven into a crazy novel.
I've tried nonfiction. It's not particularly good. I'm in a writing group, so I can tell you there are.
You are? Yes. I was just emailing with Megan. Yeah.
She's awesome.
Yeah, and
she's fantastic.
Yeah, and she was sad that she couldn't be here tonight, but she was very excited. And I was like, I really need to find a writing group. Maybe I'll join your writing group.
You should.
Yeah, I don't have one in
It's a
Philadelphia.
good
Yeah, great. I also like to write and drink wine, so I'm very excited to do that. Do you guys want to open it up to questions? Does anyone have questions for Sarah?
No pressure.
No pressure. We can talk about anything. We can talk about neuroscience, molecules, the human brain.
So, Sarah, of the brain-related diseases or conditions, what do you think that are frightening people currently? What the most promising sort of landscape is most promising going forward? Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or any of the other, where we're really on the cusp of perhaps sort of coming up with a really good solution to the circumstance, or all of them still like in the shadows, the answers?
So it's a great question. So most of the conditions in the book are actually curable, and many more are treatable. And so I think there's this idea that we're going to find a cure for dementia, which is sort of a false concept, because actually what we're going to find is basically a arsenal of tools that we pick and choose from for each patient based on the sort of molecular markers of their brain. So what's going to work for one patient is not going to work for the next patient. And I think we know way more than we've ever known before about what is actually going on at a molecular level in a patient's brain without actually doing a biopsy or an autopsy. So that technology is newer and developing so quickly. And I think that's eventually what's going to crack it open. That's what they did in oncology, and it's allowed them to make such huge advances in treating cancer, and that's where we're going.
That was one of the things I found so interesting, that each brain is... Oh, you're going to go next. That each brain is so different, right? That like what works on one person isn't necessarily going to work on the other. That the molecule is just... You have to tailor it for each person, right?
Yeah, and it's been such a problem for so long. So for a long time, we were enrolling people in trials for Alzheimer's disease without really knowing if they had it. And it turns out that actually about 1 in 5 people didn't even have it in these trials. And so you obviously can't figure out if a drug works if people don't have the disease that you're studying.
Right.
So I was just going to wonder, Sarah, how much did, not having read the book, how much did your experience taking care of, I'm on the ward service now, taking care of an NMDA receptor encephalitis patient. So I'm thinking of visualizing these things, like you come home every day at night, you think about the patient that you've been treating. How much was that part of how much of that did you put into the book rather than just researching it from a distance of the kind of like your own personal touch?
So only 2 of the patients in the book were patients that I ever actually cared for, which I think was helpful just in terms of the conflict of interest. So none of them were under my care when I reached out to them. I have written about people that I'm currently caring for, but it's like more of a tender issue. So these were all people who other sort of folks from Penn had sort of referred, or so that they might be interested in being interviewed.
Right.
I do think it changed the way that I practice. Murray Grossman, who was one of the people who trained me, when people have a disease called Lewy body disease, he always points out to the Philly landscape and says, this was discovered by someone right here, and it's this like dramatic moment of feeling like, this is this like real life science, and I think it's helpful for people to understand how we know about the diseases that they have, and it also made me realize, writing it made me realize how the words that I use were totally not understandable for the average person. I remember in the writing group having a piece where I used the word dusky, and someone said, well, I don't know what dusky means. And I sort of had no idea that I must have picked up that word in medical school. So it sort of, I guess, changed how I practice.
What was it referring to?
I don't even remember.
I have no idea.
I probably cut that part out.
Okay. No, because I'm like, I don't know that either.
But it's, yeah.
So has it changed the way you practice in that you're like, oh, maybe I should speak differently when I'm talking to patients or talking to lay people?
Yeah, I think I try to use different words, and I think I think differently about what question they're actually asking.
Because I think you did a really good job in the book of speaking to lay people. Like I said, it does come across like I could understand it, and I know nothing about neuroscience. How many patients do you think know kind of this is the wrong word to use, but like the lineage of their condition, like how it was discovered and the story behind it? 'Cause I've never thought about that before, and it feels like we should know those things.
I don't think it's common knowledge, but I mean I don't think it's also common knowledge in med school because we don't learn about.
That's what I was wanting to ask next. Yeah, and did you hear any of these stories in med school?
I don't think I knew any of these in med school. But history of medicine is not sort of covered that much. And you could say, well, there's so many other things, so there's not time for that. Or you could say, well, would we have so much better grounding in these diseases if we understood how the discovery evolved?
Yes, I personally. What do you guys think? Because I personally think yes. I mean, just everything you were telling me about all of the struggles and the stories in the book too, that so many of these doctors and public health officials went through. It feels like it could inform so many decisions we are all making now about public health and dissecting things. So yeah, I want them to teach this in med school. How can we make that happen?
So they could buy a copy now.
We can buy a copy. Let's distribute this to all of the deans. There's many a medical school here in Philadelphia. But yeah, it does feel like something we should know whose shoulders who is standing on to help us fix these things. That's just more profound. I did not think of that until right now. So, who has any other questions? I have more, but all right.
As a migraine sufferer, I've always been really curious about neurological research compared to other medical fields. So could you say a little bit about like what you've learned about how research is done in your field versus other fields, and did this history make you think differently about how research should be done going forward?
I think the main thing that we're behind on in cognitive neurology is that sort of molecular approach that they've done in other fields. That we just, it took us a long time to get there, and in a lot of diseases, we're not there yet. So there are, there's a disease called frontotemporal dementia, and it's usually caused by one of two proteins, but when I see a patient in real life, I couldn't tell you which protein's causing their disease. And even if I look at the fluid that bathes their brain and their spinal cord, I can sort of tell that something is wrong, but I can't pick up those two proteins in a way that's accurate enough that I can prove to them that that's what they have. Whereas, if you have a broken bone, we can take an X-ray and prove that you have a broken bone. But if you have any headache questions, there's a wonderful headache expert in the audience.
Oh, where? I have a lot of headache questions. I would like a book on headaches, actually.
Yeah, I have a question that follows on something that Joe was asking before, which is thinking a little bit about the history of these physicians and the struggles that they had to solve this stuff. There's kind of a tension between, if only doctors are geniuses, they can solve any problem. If I can just find the right genius doctor, Dr. House will figure out the problem for me. and then the actual, problem, which is that biology's so complicated and it's so hard to find answers for stuff, and for lots of patients they'll struggle with a problem and then never actually come up with a satisfactory answer for it. So where do you think you landed in that tension between doctors as geniuses who will solve all the problems that kind of come in front of them and mysteries that will never actually get answered or just take a long time or are really hard?
Yeah, I think that tension is very well articulated. I could not have captured it better. You could say, well, look at these amazing doctors who discovered all these things. Then you could also say, well, there are a lot of smart doctors who didn't believe them, and it's not like they were all idiots. So it's really hard to figure out when these discoveries are great. People always talk about that 50% of what you learn in medical school is wrong, but we don't know which half it is. And I think that sort of rings true. And I think at the patient level, it's so hard for people to figure out when one of the stories about the woman who was sort of felt like she was in The Walking Dead. Her mom is sort of tirelessly advocating for her and was told to sort of get away and turned out to be right. But there are also times when patients have diseases where they've had wonderful care, we've done literally every test that we can do, and we still can't find the answer. And then pushing sometimes ends up being harmful to patients. And I think it's sort of impossible to know which group you're in when you're in that patient position.
Yeah, I'd love to hear more about your kind of the interview experience with the patients, and also turning that into, using their material in the book. Were there sort of like certain guidelines you had to follow, or was it, as being a medical doctor, or was it more just kind of like your own sense of, interviewing these people and turning that into these kind of larger narratives?
Yes, it's a great question, because I don't have any formal training in that stuff. But the interviews turned out to be very similar to actually just a patient visit, except they're longer. There's usually like food involved, and you get to sort of go off the books and ask questions that I don't feel like I end up having time to ask in clinic often, about sort of how these things manifest in their everyday life and what it's been like to come to the table or sort of come to terms with this diagnosis. In clinic, a lot of it is me trying to figure out what does a person have and what do we have to offer. Whereas in these interviews, more of it was, how did the disease evolve in their life and how does it actually affect them and their family? What's sort of the broader implications of it for them? And that was neat to get to be able to ask. And the patients I think I didn't realize how lonely it is to have a rare disease. I remember there's one of the characters in the book who had a very rare condition. He asked his doctor, what's going to happen? The doctor said, I don't know. And his fiance was like, this doctor is the smartest person we've ever met in our whole life, and he doesn't know how we're going to do. And that was so scary to them. So I think it was just, it was neat to get to talk to them. And they've been wonderful. On the way here, one of them sent an email inviting us to dinner. So I think they've been sort of nice relationships also.
Yeah.
So I know it's still early, but have any of your patients read what you wrote about them? And if yes, how did they react?
So I've only heard from, I sent them all books, and one of them wrote back, the one from the third chapter is about a patient who died from frontotemporal dementia, and his son carries the gene that, so it's a disease where about 20% of cases are genetic. And in this case, it was a genetic cause, and the son carries the gene, although it was totally normal right now. And he wrote an email saying that he liked the book, so it was positive, but also talking about sort of how scary it is to read his own story.
I feel like you'll probably create like a club of all of these people. When I wrote my book about nuns, like badass Catholic nuns who rule the world. Essentially, all of those nuns became my best friends. We're still on a text chain. Two of them spoke at my wedding. They also told me my husband was real cute when I sent them a picture of him when we met. So you're gonna have like a text chain
I
of
should
like
be sending photos of my husband around.
you totally should, yeah. To all of your weird brain disease sufferers. Were people relieved too to be able to talk to you? Like, was there a sense of, oh my gosh, I'm so happy you're telling my story, because so many of these stories haven't been told before like this?
I think that was, I particularly remember there was a woman who I spoke with who's in the, I can't remember which chapter number, but it's towards the end, who had thiamine deficiency, so she was deficient in a vitamin related to drinking a lot of alcohol. And she had just had a horrible course and was just sort of starting to regain her cognition. And she said exactly that, which was, I had no idea this could happen. And I wish there was more publicity around this disease.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. And also I think that there is a big relief in like knowing that someone is interested in a crazy thing that happens to you.
I think it's so isolating.
Yeah. Was that a common thread? You mentioned that, there was a lot of loneliness with rare diseases. Was that?
I think there's a feeling of fear. They all have this like fear of the future.
Mm-hmm.
And then this feeling of nobody else quite understands what I've been through.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think even when people join support groups or whatever, no one quite has a sense of like, what is it like when you get home at night and you're living with this disease and there's no one else at home, and you're just sitting with your thoughts.
Mm-hmm. Did that aspect of it inform how you think that the healthcare system and the medical establishment can help patients with that emotional and psychological side of this?
I think it's sort of I can see both sides of it. So
Mm-hmm.
sometimes I would leave thinking, well, why aren't there more support groups for people so that they can connect with other people who have these diseases? On the other hand, when there are support groups, particularly for neurodegenerative diseases that progress and change,
Mm-hmm.
we often hear people come back with one of two things. Either they say, gosh, this was so helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Or the other side is they come back and they say, everyone in this group, all of those people were so advanced, that was terrifying for me.
Mm-hmm.
Or they were so advanced, so I felt like I couldn't speak up because, my loved one isn't that bad, and I don't want to take up their time or make them feel bad because my loved one's doing better.
Right.
So it sort of goes both ways. In my mind, I wish there was some algorithm where like you put in your loved one's disease and what state they're in and what they can do, and then they match you up with like a single person. But even that's difficult because then if they go off on different courses, you end up feeling, not feeling great about it. So I don't know what the solution is.
Yeah, Tinder for rare diseases. I feel like someone at Google is probably working on that right now. Yeah.
Hi, Sarah. What are the legal and ethical considerations when you tell stories that might spill over into family issues? How do you deal with it?
So it's a great question. So there's a lawyer for that, turns out. Penn has its own paperwork, and then once I ended up decided that Norton was going to do the book, they had additional paperwork, so then you have to go back to the original people and have them sign the Norton paperwork. And then at the end of all of it, they had me talk to a lawyer about it. Some of the patients actually were totally fine having their first names and their last names even. But other patients were less fine, and so I ended up changing all of the names, but leaving in most of the details, because I think I often feel like when I read books where it's a composite patient, you sort of wonder how much of it is the real patient and how much of it is the author's shaping. So I tried to leave in the actual sort of meat of the characters. And they were all, I tried to be sort of upfront with all of them about that. And some of them actually read drafts, just cause with like sensitive issues, just to make sure that it was okay.
I'm just curious, Sarah, by the time your clinical work, not so much in the book, people see you, are they relieved when you diagnose them, or do they reject it and sort of frightened by the prospect of the rest of their lives with this condition? And do you work also, rather than in a silo, the neurological field with other schools of medicine or practitioners who would pick something up as a disease presents in a way that you might not see it initially?
Yes, it's a great question. So I think for some of the run-of-the-mill, very common diseases and diagnoses, they can be perfectly diagnosed and cared for with a primary care doctor. I think the thing that's most fulfilling is when people have less common diseases or uncommon manifestations of common diseases, and they don't know what's happening to them, and they've gone years with these progressive, they progressively can't talk, and they say, I had someone come yesterday and say, for the past 2 years, it's getting worse and worse. I started coughing, and now I sound like I'm drunk when I talk, but I'm not drunk. And we can say, this is what's going on. If I looked at your brain under a microscope, I think this is what I would see. And that's validating for them, because a lot of them come in with embarrassment over this condition because they're having these symptoms, and they go out to socialize, and they can't tell people what's happening. They just know they're not right. And I think it's really validating just to have a name to it, and also to say, here's a resource where you can read about what may happen in the future. So I think that's really helpful, even though I have to be honest with them and say, this is progressive, and I don't have a pill or an injection or a treatment, and I can't stop it. I think it's still fulfilling. I forgot the other question, sorry.
It was just about other, where
about
someone else in
introducing.
another field might pick up something that you would miss because it presents maybe
Yeah,
the way
I think
their
that
eyes
happens.
are moving, whatever.
No, that happens all the time.
Yeah.
Actually, Whitley, who's in the audience, we were just collaborating on a patient today. She's she's a movement disorders doctor. And so there's plenty of times where I see patients and I say, well, they're not moving right, but I'm not exactly sure what's wrong. And that's one of the nice things about being in a big place is that you can send people all over.
Thank you.
Thanks.
What would you say is the number one takeaway that you want people to have from your book?
I was hoping to give a sense of awe for the brain and sort of a sense that we never really pay attention to the fact that our brains do so much and so well for us. And yet, when they break, it can be so catastrophic. I don't know if I actually got there, but that was the goal.
I think you got there. I do. Do you think that we've genuinely just scratched the surface of the brain? I think that's probably a bad pun to ask a doctor, but in terms of what we know, and is there just so much, or are we in a golden age of brain science right now?
Maybe it's naive. I think we know a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, considering where we've been, I think certainly there's lots we don't know. We don't have a cure for Alzheimer's disease. That's like the holy grail that people talk about.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot that we know that we didn't know 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Alzheimer's discovered his disease in the early 1900s, and for decades and decades and decades, you couldn't really diagnose it in living people very easily. And now we have scans where you can take a picture of someone's brain and figure out if they have elevated levels of the proteins that are related to the disease. So I think we've done pretty well.
I want everyone to read the book that hasn't read the book, but give us a little taste of Alzheimer's story, because I think that that's a really interesting one.
So Alzheimer essentially was working as a psychiatrist and met this woman who was this 51-year-old woman who had lost her memory. And he thought she was sort of unusual because she was so young. There was this idea of senile dementia being caused by hardening of the arteries, but she was only in her 50s, and so that was a little bit atypical. So he ends up, his wife actually dies quite young. He ends up moving to another institution and another institution, but he sort of keeps tabs on this woman, and he sort of calls dibs on her brain, essentially, to the point where at one point her family was going to move her to another institution, and he pays out of his own pocket to keep her at this institution because he wants to be able to look at her brain when she dies.
How ethical does that feel?
Initially, I felt like it was, not particularly good, but actually when I researched it a little bit more, it actually seems like it wasn't clear that the family didn't want to move her. It seemed like they couldn't afford to, and so maybe it was not completely not in line with it. But I think it would be hard to get research funding to do that now.
Okay. Also, and I want you to continue with this story, but also, do you know any doctors that have called dibs on anyone's brain?
do. I mean, we do all the time. Ask patients in our research
Really?
report to commit to donating their brains when they pass away.
And you're like, that one is mine. I get that brain. Okay.
Well, actually, there's another story in the book where they it's an Alzheimer's study in Colombia where there's this whole clan of people who have early onset Alzheimer's disease that's caused by a genetic mutation, and for a while they couldn't prove that it was Alzheimer's disease because they hadn't looked at a brain under a microscope, and they finally were able to convince someone to donate their brain, and they literally bring it over like a commercial airplane. And this guy just goes to another researcher's house, knocks on the door, and like hands him the brain. And that it was a huge paper. It was a huge discovery. It's paved the way for enormous trials.
Did the brain get its own seat?
So then, I think if it's a lap, then
Okay, it was a lap
if it's
brain.
under 2,
A
it
lap
counts as
brain.
lap
Yeah.
child.
Yeah, exactly.
But in any case, with Alzheimer, so after this woman passes away, he gets her brain sent to his laboratory, and that's when he looks under a microscope and he sees these abnormal structures, and he goes to that lecture in Germany and delivers his results.
God, these are the stories that, I feel like I would want to know if I had a strange brain disease. Like, I would want to know the whole background of how this came about. Yes, absolutely.
There's another story that I sort of added in the book later that I didn't realize before, that there used to be this idea that the entire nervous system was made of a single cell. And that was the common belief. And then this guy, Ramon y Cajal, who was this Spanish researcher, he looks under a microscope at these particular specimens and realizes that the nervous system is actually made of lots of different cells. And it's a huge discovery. He doesn't know how to get the word out. So he decides that he's going to spend all his money printing up his results, and he's going to send it all around Europe. So he spends all his money on that. At least what's written down is that then he can't afford a nanny, so his wife is stuck doing all the childcare with no help. I think he had like 5 kids. And so he spends all his money on printing this, sends it off, and then is like expecting to get these great comments, and he doesn't hear anything. So he says, "Oh my gosh, you know what I realized? I wrote this whole thing in Spanish. I bet they don't speak Spanish." So he packs his slides and his microscopes in a suitcase and brings them to this conference in Germany, which is incidentally at the same place where Alzheimer's made his speech. The same place. And he sets up literally like a booth where he puts his slides under a microscope. And people just line up to look at his slides. And at least what's written is that the first people were like really skeptical, and then over the course of the conference, the sort of big shots at the conference end up stopping by the booth and getting convinced that he's right. And that's how the discovery was made. But you literally have to haul your supplies to another country to show people.
And bankrupt your wife and make her do all the work.
He actually wouldn't allow his wife to buy curtains because he needed money.
Is that? Oh, I wish I had talked to you before the book was published. That's a great detail.
So
it wasn't just the nanny.
The work, she couldn't buy the fabric to make the curtains because he needed that. It's a fascinating story.
Wow. She's got no childcare. Everyone can see in her windows. But, at least the discovery was made, so it was all worth it.
It was worth it.
It was all worth it. Are there any stories you left out that you wish you'd put in?
There were 2 stories there were 2 actually patient interviews 2 patient interviews and 1 historical story. There was a patient interview that I did of someone who had epilepsy that had seizures that were caused by a genetic mutation, and they also had these other episodes that looked like seizures but were actually not seizures. And then there was another patient who I'd interviewed with Huntington's disease that I didn't include. And then there was a historical story that my mother-in-law still thinks I should have left it in. So I won't live it down. But it was this wild story of a serial killer in Victorian England who actually killed more people than Jack the Ripper. And he was a physician. And he would kill people with a medication called, or not a medication, but essentially rat poison, so something called strychnine. And he eventually was caught because he wrote these letters trying to extort people and to get money out of people, and someone picked up that it was his handwriting. And but he killed something like 15 or 20 women. And the medication actually works similarly to one of the diseases that I talk about in the book.
Oh, okay.
But
Okay. I think you should have kept. I think you should have kept it in.
I'll tell my mother-in-law that she has.
I agree
she
with.
has support.
I agree with your mother-in-law. I think we probably have time for about one more question, right, Richard? One more.
One more. If not, I just want to take the opportunity to say thank you so much. Joe, you did a great job. Your question, to keep it flowing, and Sarah, you have just really illuminated a field that, or an issue or topic, subject that's really is dark and a little scary. Dark as far as unknown, not dark as forbidding. So thank you very much. I want to thank everyone for coming out and supporting Sarah and Joe in their conversation. And both of them have their books. So I'd like to leave some time so anyone who'd like to buy a book and have it signed, I'm sure either of you would be more than happy to do so. And let's give them one more hand. That was really great.
It was so fun. Thank you.
And the books are available up front. Thanks again for coming out.
Thank you so much.
That was so great. It's just so interesting. I mean it. I don't know why there wouldn't be a history of medicine in medical school, right? I'm sure you didn't miss the class.
I did miss dermatology.
Yeah, no, this was so good. Was it? I feel